Oge's life had always seemed like a dream come true. Living in the bustling city of Lagos, she had met Emeka, a charming man with an air of mystery. Their courtship was swift but intense, and within a year, they were married. Their love was the envy of everyone around them, his kindness, her warmth, their two beautiful children, Chidera and Noso. Life, for her, seemed perfect. Emeka was a dedicated husband, never missing a day of work, always providing for the family. Though sometimes she noticed strange things, like how his side of the bed never seemed to be warm, or how he would disappear for hours during the night, she always chalked it up to work stress. Yet, there were those odd moments. Once, Oge found an old picture of Emeka in a drawer. He looked exactly the same as the day they had met, despite the photograph being dated over 30 years ago. Confused, she questioned him about it, but he laughed it off, telling her it was a mistake. His response felt genuine, and she quickly dismissed her suspicions. But, the image lingered in her mind, quietly unsettling her. What kind of mistake could explain such a thing? The city moved fast, and so did her life, leaving little room for such doubts. As the years went by, Oge became more deeply entwined in her roles as a wife and mother, burying those nagging questions. Emeka was everything a woman could want in a husband: attentive, supportive, loving. And Lagos was the perfect place to raise a family. But something was always just beneath the surface, a shadow in her seemingly perfect life, waiting to reveal itself. One cold Harmattan night, Oge awoke to a faint whisper. It wasn't unusual for Emeka to leave the bed, but this time, she felt compelled to follow him. Quietly, she tiptoed down the hallway, the faint glow of the streetlights outside casting eerie shadows through the windows. She found him standing in the middle of their living room, staring into space, murmuring something she couldn't understand. Her heart pounded, and she froze in place. It was as though he wasn't there, his eyes distant, his body unmoving, except for the quiet whispers escaping his lips. She called his name, softly at first, then louder, but he didn't respond. The room suddenly felt too small, the air thick with something she couldn't name. After a few minutes, Emeka finally turned, his face devoid of the warmth she knew. His eyes, usually full of love, seemed hollow. "Go back to bed, Oge," he said in a voice that sent chills down her spine. She had never felt so disconnected from him before, like he was slipping away from her, becoming someone, or something, she didn't recognize. The next morning, he acted as though nothing had happened. He kissed her on the cheek and greeted the kids with his usual enthusiasm, leaving for work as though the night before hadn't been filled with unsettling mystery. Oge tried to shake off the incident, but something had shifted. She could no longer ignore the growing sense that something was terribly wrong. Who was Emeka, really? Days turned into weeks, but Oge's unease only grew. She began to notice small things she had once overlooked: how Emeka never seemed to age, how he never caught a cold, how his reflection in the mirror seemed to flicker for just a second before stabilizing. She confided in her close friend, Chioma, who suggested they visit a pastor known for his spiritual insights. At first, Oge dismissed the idea, not wanting to entertain such superstitions. But the more she thought about it, the more desperate she became for answers. One evening, while the children were asleep, Oge confronted Emeka. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I'm your husband," he replied simply, but something in his tone sent her spiraling into panic. She pressed further, demanding answers, but he remained vague, deflecting her questions with calm indifference. It was as though he didn't even understand her concern, or worse, didn't care. That night, as Oge lay in bed, unable to sleep, she decided to investigate. She rummaged through old documents, hoping to find anything that might explain Emeka's strange behavior. What she found was worse than anything she could have imagined. A death certificate. Emeka's death certificate, dated 10 years before they even met. Every muscle in her body tightened as her breath caught in her throat. The man she had been married to for over a decade, the father of her children, was dead, or worse, a ghost. Oge sat frozen, her eyes glued to the death certificate. Her mind raced with disbelief. How could Emeka be dead? She had touched him, loved him, shared her life with him. But the certificate, yellowed and worn, was undeniable proof. It bore his name, his date of birth, and his date of death, 10 years ago. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing against her as if suffocating her with the weight of this terrifying truth. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was some kind of clerical error. Perhaps there were two Emekas, and this was some strange coincidence. But deep down, she knew better. Everything, the picture, the strange behavior, the whispers, suddenly made sense. Emeka wasn't alive. She had been living with a ghost. Oge felt tears sting her eyes, but fear overpowered the sorrow. What did this mean for her and her children? Were they in danger? Determined to confront him, she tucked the death certificate into her pocket and went downstairs. Emeka sat in the living room, calmly watching the news. He turned to her and smiled, but his smile, once so reassuring, now sent a shiver down her spine. She couldn't find the words. How could she ask him what he was? What he wanted? Her throat tightened as her fear and confusion consumed her, leaving her speechless. Unable to confront Emeka directly, Oge decided to seek outside help. She contacted Chioma and explained everything. Chioma's face turned pale as she listened. Oge, this is beyond ordinary, Chioma whispered, gripping Oge's hand tightly. They both agreed that a visit to the pastor was no longer optional. Something sinister was at play, and they needed answers. The next day, they visited Pastor David, a man known for his spiritual prowess. He listened intently as Oge recounted the strange events and revealed the death certificate. His expression remained stoic, but his eyes flickered with concern. There are spirits that walk the earth, some harmless, others dangerous, Pastor David began. But this is different. A spirit living among the living for this long is rare. It feeds off your life force, Oge. The longer it stays, the weaker you will become. His words left her trembling. Was Emeka draining her life? She thought of the sleepless nights, the fatigue that seemed to cling to her lately, the way her spirit felt dimmed. She had always attributed it to stress, but now she wasn't so sure. Pastor David advised that she keep a close eye on Emeka and gather more information before taking drastic action. He offered prayers, but Oge left feeling more confused and terrified than when she arrived. Oge's fear for her children grew stronger with each passing day. If Emeka was truly a ghost, what did that make Chidera and Noso? Were they somehow part of this supernatural puzzle? She couldn't bring herself to believe that her children were anything but flesh and blood, yet their strange connection to Emeka haunted her thoughts. They had always been closer to their father than her, as if there was an invisible bond she couldn't understand. One evening, as Oge tucked the children into bed, Noso asked her a question that nearly shattered her fragile composure. "Mommy, why does Daddy never eat with us?" His innocent eyes stared up at her, waiting for an answer. Oge's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't even noticed it, but it was true. Emeka never ate dinner with them. He would sit at the table, chatting and smiling, but his plate always remained untouched. I don't know," Oge stammered, forcing a smile. "Daddy is just busy sometimes." But inside, her mind screamed. She remembered all the times Emeka had excused himself from family meals, claiming to have already eaten or needing to handle some urgent matter. Was it because he couldn't eat? Ghosts didn't need food, after all. That night, as Oge lay in bed, her thoughts spiraled. The man she had loved for over a decade, the father of her children, was something otherworldly. And the worst part? She didn't know what that meant for her or her children's future. Oge found it harder to maintain her composure around Emeka. Every time she looked at him, she saw the ghost behind the familiar face. She tried to act normal for the sake of her children, but inside, she felt trapped. Every conversation, every touch, felt wrong now. She noticed how he moved through the house, almost gliding, never making a sound. His presence once brought comfort, but now it only deepened her unease. One night, after the children were asleep, Oge decided to test a theory. She placed a glass of water in front of Emeka during dinner, watching him closely as he smiled and continued talking, but his hand never reached for the glass. "Emeka," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "drink the water." He looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm not thirsty," he replied with a soft smile, the same smile that had once made her heart skip, but now filled her with dread. Desperation gnawed at her. She needed to know the truth. That night, after Emeka went to bed, she sat in the living room, staring at the documents she had collected. The death certificate, the old photographs, and her journal where she had started recording all the strange things Emeka had done over the years. The pieces were falling into place, but the puzzle was far darker than she could have imagined. She knew she had to confront him soon, but the thought of it left her paralyzed with fear. The breaking point came on a stormy night. Lightning crackled outside, casting eerie shadows across the room as Oge sat by the window, waiting for Emeka to return home. He had gone out late again, with no explanation. Her heart pounded in her chest as the storm raged outside, mirroring the turmoil inside her. She clutched the death certificate tightly in her hand, determined to get answers tonight, no matter what. When Emeka finally walked through the door, soaked from the rain, she stood up to face him. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice trembling. He paused, his eyes flicking to the papers in her hand. "Oge, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it now. "Don't play dumb with me, Emeka," she shouted, tears welling in her eyes. "I found your death certificate. You died 10 years ago. Who are you? What are you?" For a moment, Emeka said nothing. His expression remained unreadable, but his eyes darkened. Slowly, he walked towards her, his presence suddenly feeling heavy, oppressive. "Oge," he said softly, "you weren't supposed to find out. Not like this." His words chilled her to the bone. "What are you?" she repeated, her voice barely audible. Emeka sighed, his eyes softening with an emotion she couldn't place. "I'm not what you think, but I am still the man you loved," he whispered. "But it's more complicated than that." Emeka sat down on the edge of the sofa, his once warm presence now alien and distant. "I died, yes," he said, his voice low and somber. "But I couldn't leave. I didn't want to leave." Oge's heart pounded in her chest as she listened, the reality of what he was saying sinking in. "When I met you, Oge, I had already passed on. But my soul remained tied to this world for reasons even I don't fully understand. Maybe it was you, maybe it was our love." Oge wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt like lead. "So, what does that make you? A ghost? A demon?" she asked, her voice shaking. Emeka shook his head. "I'm still me, Oge. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to lie to you. But I didn't have a choice." His voice cracked with sorrow, and for a moment, Oge saw the man she had loved for all these years, not the ghost that haunted her now. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, tears streaming down her face. Emeka looked at her, his eyes full of regret. Because I knew you would leave. And I couldn't bear to lose you. His confession hung in the air, heavy with pain. Oge's world crumbled around her. Everything she thought she knew, every moment of their life together, had been a lie. And yet, the love she felt for him still tugged at her heart, complicating the fear and anger swirling inside her. Oge stood there, her hands shaking, trying to process everything. The man she had built her life with, the father of her children, wasn't human. He had been dead all this time, and she had never known. Yet, as Emeka stood before her, looking vulnerable, his familiar eyes filled with sorrow, her emotions were tangled. Love, fear, anger, they all collided within her. She wanted to hate him for the deception, but she couldn't deny the deep connection they had shared for over a decade. Emeka, she began, her voice trembling, I loved you. I still do, but this, she gestured at him helplessly, unable to find the words to express her confusion. What are we supposed to do now? How can we keep living like this? Her voice cracked, and she fought back the tears that threatened to spill over. Emeka lowered his head, as though the weight of his existence was finally pressing down on him. I don't know, he admitted quietly. I didn't plan for any of this. I thought I could just live with you, love you, raise our children, and that it would be enough. But now that you know, I can't hide anymore. His words hung in the air, heavy and final. Oge realized that their life together could never go back to what it was. No matter what he said, nothing would ever be the same again. After that night, the air in their home became thick with tension. Oge tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for Chidera and Noso, but her mind was in turmoil. She couldn't shake the feeling that their children were somehow connected to Emeka's ghostly presence. Were they even fully human? Were they in danger? The questions plagued her every waking moment. She began watching them closely, noticing small things she had never questioned before. How Noso seemed to always know when Emeka was near, even if he hadn't entered the room yet. How Chidera had started speaking to people she claimed to see in her dreams, people Oge had never met. One afternoon, as they sat at the dining table, Chidera looked up from her drawing and said something that sent a chill through Oge's spine. Mommy, do you think Daddy will go back to his world soon? The casual way she asked it made Oge's heart race. What do you mean, his world? Oge asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Chidera shrugged, her little fingers busy coloring. The place where he belongs. He always talks about it with the people I see when I sleep. Oge's blood ran cold. What had Emeka been telling their daughter? Were the children privy to things she couldn't even comprehend? Her mind raced with terror, the boundaries between the living and the dead blurring more each day. She knew she had to protect her children, but from what? From their father? From the supernatural forces surrounding them? She was drowning in a mystery that only seemed to grow darker with every revelation. In her desperation, Oge sought out answers from those who dealt with the unknown. She visited traditional healers, spoke to elders who knew ancient stories of spirits walking among the living, and even consulted with a spiritualist deep in the heart of the city. Each one had a different explanation for what was happening. Some said Emeka was a benign spirit, trapped between worlds due to unfinished business. Others warned that spirits like him, no matter how loving they seemed, always harbored hidden dangers. It was the spiritualist who gave Oge the most unsettling answer. Sitting in her dimly lit room filled with strange symbols and burning incense, she studied Oge carefully. The spirit that walks with you is not at rest, she said, her voice low and raspy. He clings to the world of the living because of you. But his time is drawing near. If you do not release him, the balance of your home will be disrupted. The children will be affected, even you will not be spared. Oge's heart sank. Release him? How? I can't just let him go, she whispered, her voice cracking. The spiritualist sighed, shaking her head. It is not about letting go. It is about accepting the truth. The dead do not belong with the living. If you keep him here, you risk losing more than just him. Your children will inherit the darkness he carries. Oge left the spiritualist's home with her heart in turmoil. She knew what had to be done, but the thought of severing her connection with Emeka, of losing the love they shared, tore her apart. Could she truly let him go, for the sake of their children's future? Or would she cling to the hope that love could conquer even death? Days turned into weeks, and Oge remained paralyzed by indecision. The weight of the spiritualist warning gnawed at her, but the thought of confronting Emeka again left her in emotional agony. Her love for him had always been the foundation of her life, but now that very love felt like a chain, pulling her deeper into a nightmare she couldn't escape. She started avoiding him, spending more time at work, and sending the children to their grandmother's house on weekends. The children sensed the tension, but they were too young to understand the full gravity of the situation. Noso clung to her more often, his wide eyes filled with confusion as he asked where Daddy had gone. Chidera, on the other hand, had grown more distant, her once bubbly personality overshadowed by strange moods and eerie comments. One day, as Oge tucked her into bed, Chidera whispered, "Daddy says he's waiting for you to make up your mind. He's not angry." Oge's chest tightened. Emeka knew. He had always known. That night, as she lay in bed alone, she wondered how much longer she could live this way, trapped between the man she loved and the ghost he had become. She felt the walls of her life closing in, and every path forward seemed filled with pain. But her children needed her to be strong. She needed to find a way to break free before it was too late. Oge couldn't ignore the signs any longer. The children had become more involved in the supernatural world, and Emeka's once subtle presence had started manifesting in unsettling ways. Doors would open on their own, cold drafts filled the rooms, and at night, she could hear Emeka's footsteps even though he wasn't supposed to be home. The line between life and death had blurred beyond recognition, and one knew the moment of reckoning was close. Desperate for answers, Oge made another visit to the spiritualist. This time, the spiritualist offered a final test. "There is a ritual," she said, her voice heavy with caution. "If he truly loves you, Oge, he will leave peacefully. If not," she let the sentence hang ominously. Oge's heart raced, but she had no choice. The spiritualist instructed her to place a personal item of Emeka's, something deeply connected to his past, at the center of their home and wait for him to confront her. That evening, Oge carefully laid Emeka's wedding ring on the dining table, its small silver band gleaming under the light. The house was silent, the children at her mother's house for the night. She sat alone in the dimly lit room, waiting. Hours passed, but eventually, she felt the unmistakable chill that always accompanied Emeka's presence. He stepped into the room, his eyes immediately locking onto the ring. "You've made your choice," he said softly, his voice tinged with both sadness and resignation. Oge's heart pounded as Emeka approached the table, his gaze never leaving hers. For the first time, his form seemed less solid, as if he was slowly fading from the world. He stood before her, his once familiar warmth replaced by a cold that seeped into the very air around him. "I never wanted to hurt you," Emeka said, his voice a whisper. "I only wanted to be with you, to love you, but I see now that I've caused more pain than joy." Tears filled Oge's eyes as she struggled to find her voice. "Emeka, I love you. I still do," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "But this isn't living. You've been gone for so long, and I didn't even know. How can we go on like this?" Emeka's eyes softened with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. You were the reason I stayed. But now, I can see your suffering. Our children, they need you to be strong. It's time for me to let go. Oge choked back a sob as Emeka reached out, his hand hovering over hers without ever making contact. I will always love you, he whispered, his form growing fainter with each passing second. But I don't belong here anymore. And with that, Emeka's presence dissolved into the air, leaving Oge alone in the quiet house, her heart heavy with grief but finally free from the haunting shadows of their love. She collapsed onto the chair, sobbing uncontrollably, the weight of everything crashing down on her. The man she had loved for over a decade was truly gone now, and the finality of it was almost unbearable. But as the tears subsided, Olga knew that she had done the right thing, not just for herself, but for her children. It was time to rebuild her life from the pieces left behind, to give her children the future they deserve. The days following Emeka's departure were both a blur and a painful clarity for Oge. She no longer felt the strange, cold presence that had lingered in their home. The eerie manifestations ceased, no more doors creaking open on their own, no more unsettling cold drafts. But with Emeka truly gone, Oge felt an emptiness that words couldn't describe. For over a decade, she had lived with a man she loved deeply, not knowing he was a ghost. Now, she was left with two children and a future she had no idea how to rebuild. Chidera and Noso returned home, their innocent faces unaware of the true depth of what had transpired. Oge watched them, feeling a mixture of sadness and hope. She could see it in their eyes. They had questions, but they hadn't yet asked. How would she explain that their father was gone? How would she tell them the truth without scaring them? She resolved to protect them from the harsh reality for as long as she could. They had already been touched by the supernatural in ways that frightened her. Now, she would do whatever it took to give them a normal life, but it wasn't just the children she needed to care for. She had to care for herself too. Oge realized that her journey wasn't over. She had lost the man she loved, but she was still here, still alive, still breathing. And as painful as it was, she knew she had to find a way forward. She owed it to her children, and she owed it to herself. Slowly, she began the process of healing, one small step at a time. As Oge settled back into the routine of life, there was still one lingering question that haunted her. How had Emeka been able to live among the living for so long without her knowing? What had happened to him all those years ago? She needed answers, not just for herself, but for her children. If there was any part of his story that could help her understand the connection between their family and the supernatural world, she had to find it. She began digging into Emeka's past. She visited his old neighborhood in Lagos, asking questions, seeking out anyone who might remember him from before their marriage. Most people had vague memories of him, a charming, quiet man, always keeping to himself. But no one knew anything about his sudden disappearance. It wasn't until Oge met an old friend of Emeka's, an elderly man, that she began to piece together the truth. The elderly man remembered Emeka well, and he spoke of strange occurrences that happened just before Emeka's disappearance. He was involved in something dangerous, the elderly man whispered, his eyes filled with fear. There were rumors about him being part of a secret ritual, something to do with crossing over to the other side. No one ever saw him again after that. The revelation chilled Oge to her core. What had Emeka done? What kind of forces had he tangled with, and had they been the reason for his haunting presence in her life? The elderly man's words echoed in Oge's mind as she walked away from their meeting. Secret rituals. The crossing of worlds. It was like something out of a nightmare, but the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. Emeka's ghostly presence, the strange behaviors of their children, the way Chidera seemed to connect with beings from the other side, it all pointed to something far darker and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Emeka hadn't just been a victim of fate. He had tampered with forces that were never meant to be touched. Back at home, Oge couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her, lurking just out of sight. She had released Emeka, but had she truly severed the ties that bound her family to the supernatural world? She thought of her children, Chidera's unsettling dreams, Noso's strange intuition, and feared that they might still be connected to the other side. The questions that had once haunted her about Emeka now shifted to her children. Were they safe? Or had Emeka left behind something even more dangerous in his wake? Desperate, she sought out even deeper spiritual help. The spiritualist, who had initially guided her through the earlier revelations, suggested that the only way to fully sever Emeka's connection was through Chidera. He's using her, Oge. Spirits cling to what they love most, and in this case, it's Chidera, the spiritualist explained, her voice laced with caution. We must break his hold on her before he pulls her into his world. The solution was a dangerous one. Oge would have to journey into the spiritual realm herself, to confront Emeka in his world and force him to let go of their daughter. The very thought of it shook her to her core. How could she, a mere mortal, enter a realm she had no knowledge of? But she would do anything to save Chidera. Oge steeled herself, her resolve firm. She had to protect her family, no matter the cost. The final battle between the living and the dead was about to begin, and she would not lose her daughter to the ghost of her past. Oge spent the next few days preparing herself for what felt like an impossible task, entering the spiritual realm to confront Emeka. The spiritualist guided her through the rituals needed to make the crossing, emphasizing the gravity of the situation. This is no ordinary realm, Oge, she warned. The world of the dead is not governed by time or logic. Once you enter, you must be strong in your resolve. Emeka will not let go easily. On the night of the ritual, Oge's heart raced with fear and anticipation. She had sent Chidera and Noso back to her mother's house, knowing they were safer away from whatever might unfold. The room was dimly lit by candles as Mama Ibuka began chanting, her voice steady and filled with ancient power. Oge, lying in the center of the room with her eyes closed, could feel herself slipping away, like being pulled into a deep, endless sleep. Suddenly, she found herself standing in a place that was both familiar and terrifying. It looked like her home, but everything was shrouded in shadows, as if the very air around her was alive with memories. And there, standing by the window, was Emeka. He looked just as he had the last time she saw him, solid, alive, but with a strange, otherworldly glow. Oge, he said softly, his voice echoing unnaturally. You shouldn't have come here. But she had no choice. She was here to bring her family back from the brink of destruction. Oge's pulse quickened as she stood before Emeka in this eerie version of their home. She could feel the weight of his presence, as if the air around her thickened with every word he spoke. Emeka, she began, her voice shaking slightly but filled with determination, you have to let us go. You have to let Chidera go. Emeka's face softened with a sad smile, but there was something darker beneath his expression, a refusal to acknowledge the reality of what she was asking. You don't understand, he said, stepping closer. I didn't choose this. I never meant to leave you all, but now that I'm here, I can't let go. I'm still your husband, Oge. We're still a family. His words, once comforting, now chilled her to the bone. The man she had loved for over 10 years was not just a ghost, he was a force determined to hold on to her, to their children, at any cost. His love had become possessive, dangerous. You're not here, Emeka, Oge said firmly, her voice gaining strength. You're gone. And we need to leave. Chidera needs to leave. Emeka's face darkened, and the room seemed to tremble with his growing agitation. No. I won't let you take her from me. His voice boomed through the shadowy room, and for a moment, Oge felt the overwhelming force of his anger, like the weight of years of unresolved pain, pressing down on her. But she stood her ground. She had come too far to be afraid now. Oge braced herself as Emeka's ghostly form grew more menacing. Shadows around them seemed to twist and bend, as if the spiritual realm itself was reacting to his fury. But amidst the chaos, Oge remained calm, driven by the need to protect her children. This isn't love anymore, Emeka, she said softly but firmly. You're holding us back. You're holding yourself back. You need to find peace, for our sake and yours. For a moment, Emeka's face softened, as if some part of him understood what she was saying. But the shadows around him clung tighter, distorting his form, his spirit bound to a world he could no longer leave. I can't go, he whispered, almost pleading now. I don't know how to let go. The vulnerability in his voice broke something inside Oge. Despite everything, she could still feel the love they had shared. The man she had fallen in love with was still there, buried beneath the anger and confusion. Oge took a deep breath, stepping forward to touch Emeka's face, her hand passing through the cold, translucent air where his skin should have been. You have to let go, for us. For Chidera. I forgive you, Emeka. Now, you need to forgive yourself. Her words, filled with love and finality, seemed to pierce through the veil that held him. Emeka's form began to fade, the shadows dissipating as his face softened into one of peace. Thank you, he whispered, his voice barely audible as he disappeared into the ether. The room around Oge grew brighter, the oppressive weight lifting. She had done it. She had freed Emeka, and with him, their family's connection to the supernatural world. Tears filled her eyes, but this time, they were tears of release, of closure. The battle was over, and she could finally begin to heal. Oge woke up with a start, her body drenched in sweat as she lay on the floor of the spiritualist room. The candles had burned out, leaving only a faint smell of smoke in the air. She blinked, trying to gather her thoughts, but the overwhelming sense of relief was immediate. Emeka was gone, truly gone this time. She could feel it deep in her spirit. The house no longer carried that heavy, ominous feeling. It was as if a dark cloud had been lifted. The spiritualist knelt beside her, her face serene yet concerned. How do you feel? She asked softly. Oge sat up slowly, her body aching from the intense spiritual journey she had just undertaken. I think it's over, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He's gone. I could feel him leave, the spiritualist nodded, placing a reassuring hand on Oge's shoulder. You've done something not many people could. You've saved your family. Life slowly began to return to normal, but the emotional scars of what Oge had endured remained. Her nights were still filled with strange dreams, echoes of the spiritual journey she had taken. Although Emeka was gone, Oge couldn't help but wonder about the thin line between the world of the living and the dead. She had seen things, felt things, that she couldn't easily explain to others. Her relationship with her children grew stronger in the weeks that followed. She was more protective, more present, and more determined to shield them from any lingering shadows. Chidera, in particular, seemed to have forgotten everything about her ghostly connection to Emeka, and Oge was grateful for that. The little girl was back to being a carefree child, her laughter filling the home. As she pieced together fragments of information, one thing became clear: Emeka's love for her and their children had been the very thing that had kept him bound to the earthly realm. His refusal to let go, despite being dead, was a testament to how deeply he had cared for them. But that love, twisted by the supernatural forces at play, had nearly destroyed them all. It was a sobering realization, one that made Oge even more determined to cherish the present.